Thursday afternoon, February 22nd, 2024. A quiet house on Greenbrier Avenue, Pensacola, Florida. Police came here not for a homicide report. It was only a welfare check, because no one had been able to contact the two elderly people living inside for days. When the door was opened, the scene was described as horrifying, and in the body cam footage, the son stood frozen, trying to keep his voice steady as he said something very softly to the officer. "My mother once asked for a restraining order, but they said it wasn't violent. So she let him stay. One more time." Behind him, inside a house that had been silent for far too long, the family's small dog, the only living being left, was trembling, hiding in a dark corner. So what happened inside this house, just 7 days after a grandson had been released from prison? And why had the warning signs appeared, yet no one managed to hold the door shut in time? This is the story of Jordan Dominique King, 24 years old, and of two victims, his grandparents, who opened the door of their home to give their grandson one last chance. Just 1 week after Jordan left prison, the two grandparents were found dead inside that very house, each in a different room with injuries caused by severe blunt force. Jordan King was arrested later that same day. After that, a Florida grand jury charged him with 2 counts of first-degree murder, charges that carry the possibility of the death penalty or life in prison without parole. But this case is not only worth following because of the severity of the charges, it is worth pausing and looking at closely. Because this is where family compassion collided head-on with a system that failed to intervene in time, where signs of psychological instability had been seen, but were not deemed dangerous enough to trigger the protection that was needed. In this episode, we are not looking for sensationalism. We will not describe violence, and we will not tell this story as an emotional indictment. We will follow the evidence, follow the timeline, and above all, place the victims at the center. Because before this became a case, it was already a family. Before this story became an investigative file, the King's grandparents were very ordinary people, longtime residents on Greenbrier Avenue. To their neighbors, they were not a loud family. Just two gentle elderly people living quietly, always greeting others over the fence and willing to open their door to help when someone needed it. To the family, they were the final anchor. Jordan King grew up through a series of ruptures. His mother passed away, and his biological father was imprisoned while he was still young. When Jordan left prison, his grandparents were the only ones who said, "You can come here." They knew their grandson was not well. They knew about the paranoia, knew about the unease that others had also noticed, but they still chose to believe that if there was a place safe enough, patient enough, it would be the family home. Just a few days before the tragedy, Mrs. King was still struggling with something very small. Her phone had fallen into a sink full of water. Following her son's instructions, she carefully placed it in a bag of rice, just to keep the phone working, so she would not lose contact with her children and grandchildren. When the phone lit up again on Friday, it was a very quiet kind of joy. No one knew that. It would also be the last time she was still connected to the outside world. A neighbor later recalled another image, Mrs. King standing by the window, calling her grandson when she saw Jordan standing outside in the harsh sun, afraid to step inside because of invisible fears. She even asked the neighbor to hand the phone to Jordan just to coax him into the house, out of concern for his own safety. After the crime, that house did not only lose 2 lives, it left a void for the son, the one who had to suppress his grief to help police uncover the truth. And inside the silent house, only the family's small dog remained, the sole survivor who had hidden away in a corner out of fear. The king's grandparents did not see their grandson as a recently released criminal. They also did not see him as a psychiatric case. They saw him through the eyes of parents trying to hold together the last remaining fragments of a family. And it was there. That compassion, the most beautiful human quality, became the place where tragedy began. On February 15th, 2024, Jordan Dominique King walked out of prison. There was no one waiting. No one is standing at the gate. Just a procedural release. Quiet and quick. Jordan had no car, no job waiting, and in reality, nowhere else to go except his grandparents' house. According to parole records, he had completed his sentence. There were no mandatory mental health supervision conditions, no required reintegration monitoring. On paper, everything was closed. But in real life, the rhythm began to slip very early. Just a few days after returning to his grandparents' home, the familiar signs of instability reappeared. Not loudly, not violently, just the sense that Jordan was not truly settled in his own mind. On February 18th, police received a call from a Studio 6 location. An employee reported a young man, acting aggressively, refusing to leave the area, making people around him feel unsafe. That person was Jordan King. No one was injured. There was no specific act of assault. And as in many previous instances, the situation ended without any coercive measures or medical intervention being applied. Viewed in isolation, this was just a minor incident, a young person struggling to control his behavior. But the next day, things slipped one step further. On the afternoon of February 19th, those signs no longer appeared in public, but right outside the door of the King grandparents' home. At approximately 1:44 p.m., a neighbor saw Jordan, standing in the yard under the harsh sunlight, but afraid to go inside. According to the account, Jordan said he heard the sound of someone violently shaking the handle of the back door. And in his mind at that moment, there was a threat waiting inside the house. Mrs. King saw this from the window. She did not scream. She did not call the police. She did not panic. She called her grandson, spoke slowly, patiently. When Jordan still remained outside, she asked the neighbor to hand the phone to him, just to reassure, just to persuade, just to bring him into the house. No 911 call was made. No involuntary hospitalization was requested. No one said, "This is a dangerous threshold." From the outside, this looked like just a family, trying to manage within their own capacity. But when the timestamps are placed side by side, a different picture slowly emerges. Jordan had just been released. Signs of paranoia appeared almost immediately, and every response stopped at the level of endurance. Act 1 of the stories closes there, not with an explosion, but with a prolonged silence. A silence that later, after everything had already happened, would be looked back on as opportunities that passed by with no one holding on to them. After the afternoon of February 19th, the house on Greenbrier Avenue became unusually silent. There were no more calls, no more responses, and no one in the family could reach the King grandparents. A day passed, then another day. By Thursday afternoon, February 22nd, that silence had stretched too long to continue being ignored. The son of the King's grandparents called the police, not to report a homicide, just to request a welfare check. He said that he had not been able to contact his parents for days. The front porch light was still on. The newspaper lay untouched in the yard, no one having picked it up. When officers arrived, everything outside looked like any other day. There were no signs of forced entry, no unusual sounds. The front door was closed. The son entered the access code. 3 minutes later, the mechanical lock clicked open. In that moment, the house was no longer a place of shelter. What police saw inside was described with a single word: horrifying. 2 victims were found in 2 different rooms of the house. The preliminary cause of death was severe blunt force trauma. There were no signs that a stranger had forced entry from outside. There was no scene ransacked in the manner of a typical burglary. In the living room, Mrs. King's wallet lay on the table, still there. But inside it, the credit cards were missing. Amid that scene, police also found a surviving living being. The family's small dog was hiding in a corner, trembling, afraid to come out. For investigators, the picture narrowed very quickly. The person who had lived with the victims in their final days was Jordan King. Released from prison just 1 week earlier, and currently not present at the scene. Act 2 of the stories ends here, not with screams, not with chaos, but with a cold truth. The worst had already happened. Inside a closed space, after days of silence and there was no way to turn back time, when the scene was secured, police began narrowing the scope of the investigation. No speculation was needed. They looked at what was most obvious. The person who had lived with the 2 victims in their final days was Jordan Dominique King. He had been released from prison exactly 1 week earlier, and he was not at the house when police arrived for the welfare check. The family provided additional information. Jordan did not have a car. He usually traveled on foot, and when he wanted to avoid people he knew, he often walked through forest trails near the Signal Hill area. Based on that information, police began searching the surrounding area. There was no loud chase, no sirens, just finding the right person in the right place. Several hours later, a resident called the police. They reported seeing a man, matching the suspect's description, walking along the road. When officers approached, Jordan King did not run. He did not resist. He was alone, unarmed. During the interaction, Jordan made disorganized statements. He said he had been walking all day, that he was walking to prison, and that he was being followed, being targeted. Police noted those statements without arguing, without drawing conclusions. Jordan King was taken into custody without incident. Later that same day, he was transported to the Escambia County Sheriff's Office and was officially considered the primary suspect in the homicides on Greenbrier Avenue. Act 3 ends here. There was no confession, no final conclusion, only the moment when the story left the realm of family and passed into the hands of the law. At this stage, the investigation began to shift direction, not because of emotion, but because certain pieces of evidence no longer aligned with the initial narrative. The first data point: Mrs. King's wallet. When police examined the living room, the wallet was still on the table, not discarded, not hidden, but inside it, all of the credit cards were gone. This detail is critical. It suggests that this was not a scene abandoned in panic. Someone had chosen to take the cards and leave behind what was unnecessary. The second data point: the house was a closed space. The front door had an automatic lock. To enter the house, a code was required. When the son arrived, he had to enter the code. Wait several minutes before hearing the lock disengage. That means the likelihood of a stranger forcing entry from outside is very low. From these 2 data points, investigators asked a direct question. If this were only an uncontrolled paranoid episode, why were the credit cards taken? And if Jordan said he was just walking and walking to prison, then why did he leave the house using forest trails, paths that the family confirmed he often used to avoid being seen? Jordan's statements at the time of arrest clearly showed disorganization, but his actions, by contrast, suggested a degree of choice and direction. It is at this point that the investigation was no longer focused solely on the question, what happened, but shifted to a more important one. Did the paranoia fully dominate his behavior? Or did it exist alongside deliberate, calculated decisions? If standing in the investigator's position at that moment, the next steps would be very clear. Trace the use of the credit cards, determine who had the last access to the house, and place the suspect's actions against specific time markers. The turning point of this case did not come from a confession. It came from the moment when the evidence began to speak differently than the story being told. Even though Jordan King had been arrested, this story was still not complete. Not because there was no suspect, but because there were gaps in information that prevented the picture from being whole. The first gap lies in time. The family stated that their last call with Mrs. King occurred on Saturday afternoon. Police did not enter the house until Thursday afternoon. Between those 2 points, there were several days of silence. But we do not yet know exactly when the tragedy occurred within that silent window. This is not merely a technical detail. It determines whether Jordan King left the house immediately after everything happened, or remained there for some period of time. And if there was a period of remaining, then the question is no longer simply whether he left or not, but rather, during that time, what was his psychological state? The second gap is not inside the house, but outside the system. Jordan had just been released from prison. Prior paranoid behavior had already been documented. The family had tried to create a safe distance, but was refused because he had never been violent. What remains unclear is this. After his release, was anyone actually responsible for monitoring him? Was there any mechanism to respond when the warning signs appeared in rapid succession? When there are no answers to those questions, everything falls back onto the family. 2 elderly people, without training, without tools, left with nothing but patience and care. The third gap returns us to the scene itself, smaller but heavy. Mrs. King's wallet was found in the house. It was not taken, but the credit cards were gone. We do not yet know whether those cards were used, and if so, at what point in time. This gap matters because it sits directly at the boundary between 2 very different interpretations. On one side, actions carried out during a total psychological collapse. On the other, choices made afterward, however brief, however limited. These 3 gaps do not exist separately. The time of death tells us when everything began to fall apart. The lack of monitoring shows why no one intervened in time, and the credit cards raise the question of what happened last. They connect into a single line, leading directly to the central question of this case. Is this a tragedy purely of uncontrolled illness, or a moment where illness and human decision-making collided, within a system no longer capable of holding anyone back? At this point, the investigation is no longer searching for new details, but beginning a different task, placing the existing facts side by side and seeing which line of reasoning stands most firmly. First is capability and motive. Jordan King has a history of paranoia. Those symptoms had been documented multiple times, even before his release. This suggests that at the time of the incident, his ability to control perception was already very low. However, at the same time, the evidence at the scene points to actions involving choice. The credit cards were taken. The suspect left the house and moved along familiar forest trails. This raises an intermediate possibility, not fully lucid, but not an absolute loss of control either. Next is opportunity and time. The house on Greenbrier Avenue was a closed environment. There were no signs of forced entry from outside. Jordan was the only person living with the victims in their final days, and he was also the only one to leave the scene before police arrived. Looking at this factor alone, there is no scenario more reasonable than one in which the suspect had direct and continuous access to the victims. Finally, there is physical evidence in post-incident behavior. There were no cameras inside the house, no widely released technological evidence, but there are very basic elements. The suspect was arrested while walking alone, with no clear escape plan and making disorganized statements. These details do not eliminate criminal responsibility, but they do indicate a complex psychological state where behavior does not fully align with the logic of an organized criminal plan. When these three branches are placed together, a provisional conclusion begins to emerge. The branch of opportunity and time is the strongest. It answers the questions of who and when, without requiring further speculation. The branch of motive and mental state helps explain why, but still requires medical and legal data to determine the degree of influence. As for physical evidence, at this stage, it remains the portion still awaiting completion. Therefore, what must be emphasized is this. What we have just walked through is a chain of reasoning based on publicly available facts, not a court ruling. Jordan King is still presumed innocent until a final verdict is reached. But the logic of the case already shows one thing clearly. This was not a random moment of eruption, but the result of multiple factors quietly stacking on top of one another within a very short period of time. At present, the case has entered its formal legal phase. Jordan Dominique King has been arrested and is being held at the Escambia County Jail without bond. Initially, he faced 2 charges of second-degree murder. Later, a grand jury elevated the charges to 2 counts of first-degree murder, the most serious charges under Florida law. That means, if convicted, King faces only 2 possible outcomes: life imprisonment without the possibility of parole or the death penalty. However, the trial process cannot yet begin. The court has ordered a mandatory psychiatric evaluation to answer a foundational question: whether Jordan King is legally competent to understand the proceedings and assist his defense counsel. This is not an exception. In cases with clear indications of mental disorder, this is a required step to ensure a fair legal process. What must be clarified is this. A competency evaluation is not a judgment of guilt or innocence. It only determines whether the trial can proceed at this time. While awaiting the evaluation results, prosecutors continue to build their case. The victim's family, meanwhile, must continue waiting, not for answers about who did what, but for an answer to when justice can even begin. The case, therefore, remains in a suspended state, with enough evidence to prosecute, but not yet enough conditions to reach a conclusion. When everything is over, what remains of this case is not just an indictment. What remains is a house that was once opened out of compassion and 2 people who no longer have the chance to walk out. The King's grandparents were not 2 victims on paper. They were people who chose to give one more chance, when most would have chosen distance, and it is precisely there that this case raises a difficult but necessary question. When warning signs have appeared, but are not enough to trigger intervention, who stands on the final line? If the answer is always the family, then the price will sometimes be something no one can afford to pay. We will still have to wait for the court to know where this case will ultimately lead. But even before a final verdict, one thing is already clear. This was a tragedy that unfolded in a very short span of time, and there were opportunities that passed by with no one able to hold them back. If you are listening to this point, I would like to invite you to leave a comment in the most respectful way possible. In this case, which gap do you believe is the most critical? The time of death, post-release supervision, or the story of the credit cards? And if you were the one forced to make a decision at that moment, where would you place your priority to prevent the tragedy from happening? Thank you for listening to the very end. We do not follow stories like this to satisfy curiosity. We follow them to better understand risk, and to remember that behind every case there is always a human being.